quick topic here, and that is the explosive growth of MGTOW in Australia, land down under. Australia is kind of an interesting place. It's, of course, considered one of these British Commonwealth countries. Lots of English influence. Most of its history, at least since like the 1800s. Australia, of course, had an interesting history. If we go back in time, this was actually a country that many prisoners would be sent to from England and any of the UK empire. The prisoners were essentially sent to Australia. But Australia has been a really interesting country in the growth of MGTOW. As we can see, there's an incredible amount of problems with the relationship and marriage scene over there. It's terrible, honestly, how Australia has progressed. I've met some guys from Australia, and if we go back like 30 or 40 years ago, Australia actually was pretty decent, honestly, for dating and for relationships. It was actually a pretty nice place for a guy to find a wife. I actually used to live in Minnesota, and one of my neighbors actually, he was, I believe at the time, probably around 82 years old. His son actually, he had moved to Australia after he finished his undergraduate. He did a medical residency, I think it was in dentistry in Australia, and eventually decided to stay and practice medicine there as a dentist, and he actually has been living there probably since then. Sometime in the 1990s, he found a woman and got married and had kids. I don't know what the state of his marriage is now, but he set up a career, and one of the main reasons was that he just liked Australia. It was very nice at that time. We're thinking of like late 80s, early 90s was probably around the time that he went there. So this just kind of shows you how quickly it's changed. It was a fairly decent place quite recently for a man to obtain a relationship, but that's obviously changed in recent years, like many of the other Anglo-based countries. Australia is, of course, considered a first world country. It's decently wealthy by most economic metrics. This is one of the roots of the problems with relationships in Australia. The fact that just like in America and just like in England or Canada, the women don't need men there for their economic means. In fact, many women actually probably do better economically than their men counterparts, because there's a plethora of government jobs to go around, and many private sector jobs are very accessible for women to be employed. With the strong increase in females filling these private sector and public sector roles in the last 15 to 20 years, it's of course pushed men out of the workforce. It's also greatly elevated their economic means, that females, of course, don't need a man for their economic sustenance. They can just simply go into these career places and find a good job, simply just can use men for whatever novelty they desire them for. And therefore, Australia just becomes another example, one of these countries where it's basically this 95-5 rule, where 95% of women are going for the top 5% of men. Because like I said before, the lifestyle now, the standard of living for women at this point is so high in Australia that many of them are actually making more than their male counterparts. But yet, females, there's still one, of course, a guy that makes more, that's very attractive, that has a lot of social status, all these concepts that we see in other Anglo-based countries like Canada and US. But of course, very few of these guys fall into that category. Most of those guys have plenty of options. In fact, many of them are probably already married. That's just the reality here. This has caused many men just simply to be driven out of the dating pool. I think if you went back 15 to 20 years ago, Australia would have had a scene that was more accessible for the average guy to date. Perhaps at that time more men were truly MGTOW. They had had relationships, maybe marriage, and they were just moving away from that because the relationship went south or their marriage went south and they had gotten divorced. Whereas now I believe that Australia is more one of these incel kind of MGTOW countries where it's not really men choosing to go their own way. The youngest generation, like Generation Z, have no choice in the matter and are just simply priced out of the dating pool. They don't have any options. They end up never having that dating experience and being what's known as incel. Incel, of course, is more of this classification of men who would be open for a relationship, but simply can't get one, so they have no other choice. They are just simply priced out of the dating pool. This has become very, very rampant in recent years in Australia, and probably will just progress more. The tax situation in Australia is on par with places like Canada, US, very high income tax, property tax, sales tax. Australia is considered a very expensive country to live. Anyone who's traveled there, whether we're talking about Sydney or Melbourne, it's remarkably expensive. I've heard in Australia, in the big cities, like a pack of cigarettes can be like $20 a pack. Alcohol is highly taxed. Many other consumer goods, food prices, and gasoline for cars, and among other products, are very expensive. Australia, even by American standards, is considered very expensive. I've known Americans who had traveled to Australia for vacations, and they had all said it's very expensive to live there. Just for a man to sustain a decent standard of living there for themselves is challenging. Now, for them to sustain another person or kids, it's even more challenging, and they're going to need a lot of money. They're going to have to be in the higher income bracket, especially if they're living in big cities like Sydney or Melbourne, which is why I said many guys are just simply priced out of the dating pool because it's just so expensive. These guys, they can barely afford housing and food and gasoline costs for their cars, and so they can't even think about like supporting another woman, or at least impressing a woman to be interested in a relationship. Australia also has had this kind of inflated priced housing market and real estate market because there's been a huge influx of people coming in from these other countries like China or India, among other places, Latin America. Many wealthy people are coming from these countries, especially within East Asia. They bought up a lot of these properties, and the housing market just becomes more and more expensive because obviously the value of the real estate just skyrockets. I mean, if you go back 20 years in Sydney or Melbourne, many of these apartments and homes were probably 1/3 of the price that they are today. The prices just keep on going up. Just for a smaller house in one of the big cities like Melbourne or Sydney, you're going to be paying at least $800,000 nowadays. And that's not to account for a bigger house or apartment. Many of these properties are going to be north of $1 million, $2 million. It's insane how the property market has just shot up. The prices are just simply too expensive for the average person, and that's unfortunately the reality for many guys. They cannot afford to buy property there because it's experienced such a huge influx of buyers from foreign markets, and Australia has not implemented any controls on their market in this sense, and the prices have just gone through the roof. This progression will just likely continue and just price many domestic people out of the market. Many of these people that are buying these properties from like Asia, they may not even really hardly live in Australia. They may only be there like 2 months of the year, and the other 10 months they're back in their home country or in other countries where they own other properties. So it's just really crazy how this has influenced the whole housing market for common citizens in Australia. Australia's elected officials certainly don't help the situation. Australia has been more liberal-leaning country now for many years. They certainly support many of the draconian policies that greatly hurt men in their country. And this is where Australia is. Many men, of course, also may support these policies in Australia, no question. And many of the Australian politicians just continue supporting these very liberal causes. They have many social initiatives like we see in America. You have all these kind of equality bills in place. I've read that they have many policies concerning the Aboriginal people, and they have to essentially, many of these people are living off subsidies, and they get like all these free handouts, and this is what you'd expect in a country like Australia. These people obviously are prioritized. Australians, or the Australian government, still feels obliged to pay out these people. Injustices that occurred many, many years ago. The Australian government, amongst other issues, are paying out massive amounts of money to all these social causes that are senseless, of course. Most of the elected officials in Australia are kind of like these puppet leaders that British or US government would approve of. And many of these leaders are, of course, very liberal. Due to most of the country being more to the left, they're very liberal. And these political leaders just continue to push certain policies that hurt many men out there. And this trend just continues. They've also implemented many of the same divorce laws and child custody laws that we see in the US, where men have to pay huge alimonies and child support once they get divorced, when they go through that process. And this is the norm in Australia. Men also face the risk of losing their children and not being able to see them. And these are all issues that really make men not interested in marriage in Australia, and often not even in long-term relationships. It's because it's became such a complicated mess there. Also, Australian females aren't renowned for being very high quality, whether it's physical beauty or internally, and many men aren't going to chase after the low-tier females there. Due to other issues, also, the typical Australian female is not nearly as attractive as they used to be, and it just gets worse. Obviously, the rate of obesity goes up like it has in other Anglo-based countries, and Australia is no exception, and this has had a terrible impact in this country. I've heard of men saying that females there that are maybe like 5 or 6s are often with guys that are like 9 or 10 in terms of look scale. You'll see many guys that very good looking guys that are with these very like mediocre looking females, and this is quite normal because these guys have really no other options. Like I said, the super attractive, the 8, 9 and 10 kind of females have so many options, and they're probably shooting for the guys that are in the very top 1% economically speaking, guys that essentially have a huge dating pool accessible. Just as we see in other countries, that this is often the mindset of females, that they just all go for the same very, very top tier guy. Online dating, of course, is another major area that's impacted Australia and has priced many men out of the dating market. Dating apps, like in other first world countries, are very common. Tinder is one example, and many people, many younger females, of course, use Tinder, and they all go for the same type of guys. Many guys obviously go on Tinder, and they are maybe lucky if they match with a couple females in Australia, and many of these guys don't even end up going on a single date with an Australian. How these dating apps obviously are in these countries is that most men obviously don't really get much of anything, and even an average looking female will have many options for dating. And of course, you have females that just go onto these dating apps for the attention of men, and they don't have any intention to even go on a date with any of these guys that they're meeting on the dating apps. Many females don't care about being in any kind of committed kind of situation or relationship. There's a large percentage of females that aren't even in a relationship or marriage. These females would classify themselves as single. They're really not. They're still hooking up often, but they're not in a committed relationship because, like I said before, they don't really need a man for anything. I guess unless a man were to come along that had a lot of economic means, then they perhaps would be interested, but those guys obviously have many options. One other area that Sandman has mentioned about Australia in his MGTOW videos, that the social networks are very important in Australia for dating. For people who say don't have like a network, beautiful women around them, it's very hard for a guy just to randomly find a woman that's attractive, that is single, that would be interested in dating. Many of these social networks are forming from high school or maybe university. So once these people get out of those situations, if the guy can't have success with online dating, it's very problematic, because these social networks are the main way that guys and women date in Australia. Through this social network, essentially partners get kind of rotated, passed around, you might say. This is actually similar also to Chile. This is a very common situation that the partners kind of get rotated around, if that makes sense. kind of like musical chairs with dating, and this is often common. So if a guy say they didn't have attractive social network from high school or university, or they didn't have any kind of network, they were kind of more of a loner, be very challenging if they weren't a attractive guy that could go on a dating app and find a woman this way. Because like I said, finding the random attractive woman is often not the case in Australia. This will not work unless the guy has huge economic status. This is not a viable way to find a partner. Australia will likely just continue to worsen in coming years, and this is of course where the explosion of MGTOW has taken place. Many guys in Australia, Australian men, also have decided to leave the country, to go to Asia, maybe to Europe, find places that are just more pleasant, more suitable to find a relationship, or just simply to live a good standard without having to pay so much. And like I said, they're paying a lot of taxes, but many of these men don't really benefit from these taxes anyhow, so they are often better off just leaving their country and going elsewhere. It's becoming very common. You'll find in the countries that I've lived over the years or traveled to, I've met like Australians basically in every country I've ever traveled to or lived. This just demonstrates how common it is for Australian men to leave and to settle elsewhere. It's likely to become the norm for Generation Z. We could see a rate of maybe like 40 or 50% MGTOW guys in the next 10 years coming from Australia, or this incel category, guys that aren't exactly MGTOW, where it's more of this incel category where the guy didn't really have any choice. This is the path that's likely to continue. The one last area that obviously has affected and impacted Australia is the education system. Like we've seen in America and Canada, public education is quite the norm in Australia. And these essentially serve as indoctrination centers for both males and females through their formidable years. And it definitely has more impact on females. And these education systems, of course, completely plant ideals in these females that is contrarian to traditional family values. And as long as these indoctrination centers continue to run and to be paid and supported by taxpayers, they will continue churning out these females that have been planted with very toxic ideals of the world. This is the current state of Australia, and with this, MGTOW will just continue to boom. Like I said, for Generation Z, we'll likely see a huge explosion. It could be 40, 50, 60% of these guys going MGTOW or MGTOW/incel. It will be very interesting to see the progression. Tell me what you thought of this video and give me feedback below. Thank you.